ordination training by Desmond Tutu when he was Bishop of Johannesburg. And Archbishop Makgoba was elected Bishop Suffragan of Grahamstown in 2002, Bishop of Grahamstown in 2004, and Archbishop in Cape Town in 2008. Again, you see the diversity of his knowledge basis. He holds a BSc degree, a BA honors in applied psychology, and an M.Med in education psychology from the University of Wits, and a PhD from the University of Cape Town. Honorary degrees from Canada, South Africa, and the United States. And he serves as Chancellor of the University of Western Cape. Just to complete that history, that natural connection. Archbishop, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof. I'm humbled by that introduction, and I am humbled to have been asked to share, albeit briefly. And if I may take this opportunity to say, I was asking myself, are we at the Thabo Makgoba lecture or not? Because that's where the last time I saw you giving a beautiful rendition there. So thank you for what you shared there. So dear friends of King's College, UWC, UWs as we fondly call it, and other participants. And indeed, thank you to my colleague who has just offered a prayer. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity of sharing some of the reflections with you on Archbishop Desmond's prayer life. I'm so grateful to UWC and King's that the keynote academic tribute to our beloved Archbishop Emeritus has come together in this way. As one of those selected by the Arch, as you rightly pointed out, back in the 1980s, it is a particular privilege to be asked to share some informal thoughts. These, I don't want to pretend that they're academic thoughts, but they're just informal thoughts about his prayer life. Archbishop Desmond, following the injunction in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 5 and 6, never spoke about his fasting and prayer in any detail. So we have to rely mainly on what we observed to give you a flavor of his prayer life. One of my earliest recollections was seeing him take his blisteringly fast 5 a.m. daily walk on the dusty roads around Modderpoort in the Free State, the Rural Conference Center in South Africa, where he used to hold provincial meetings. As he walked, you could see his lips moving as he did what Mama Leah used to call his daily cook's tour, praying for situations around the world. And it is thanks to Mama Leah that we know that during his active ministry, he was up at 4 a.m., kneeling alongside his bird or curled up like a fetus, saying his prayers. He lived his prayer life with extraordinary discipline. People are sometimes described as having iron self-discipline, but iron is brittle. So in the Arch's case, I prefer to talk about steel self-discipline, a discipline forged and tempered in the heat of the struggle against apartheid. Those who walked with him in the early mornings in those days testify as to how, no matter what's the crisis, no matter what's the emergency he was facing that day, he always kept strict silence as he soaked the world in prayer. Then during the day, his schedule was organized around church prayers, his personal prayer, morning prayer with the clergy, followed by a daily Eucharist, 30 minutes of personal prayer at lunchtime, 30 minutes of personal prayer before formal evening prayer, and compline often with Liam, late at night. In one of the rare comments on his prayer life, he used to say that if he missed one of these prayer times, it felt as if he had forgotten to brush his teeth. When he was Archbishop at Bishop's Court, the staff here reckoned that if you added his devotional reading to his prayer and worship time, he would spend 6 or 7 hours a day in silence or services. I know academics will say that is too much. And when he was away from home, he kept up the routine, whether it was in cathedrals, the King's College Chapel in London, or in early morning train to Exeter, as the former Dean of King's College, Richard Burridge, has told in a story that has become a legend, that Desmond Tutu was the other side of the ebullient extrovert we all experienced. Towards the end of his life, when I visited him in hospital, the first thing you saw at his bedside were his prayer book, his Bible, and a sheaf of papers comprising the prayer lists of dioceses, parishes, and organizations with which he kept in touch. On one of these visits, I asked him what prayer meant to him personally. He replied that if he didn't follow those prayer routines, almost invariably, something will go wrong in his life. He went on in these beautiful words, and I'm quoting him verbatim. I am not as sharp as I would have been otherwise, he said. I am not as gentle as I would otherwise have been. You get to learn that, yes, you rely utterly and completely on God, that God is reliable and is always waiting for us to turn to God. He added, but it is not as if God forgets us. One of the things you learned at college was that you are one with 7 billion people, and God knows each one of us by name. Beautiful. When we are each a special creation, you might not be a VIP, he said, but you are a VSP, a very special person, because you are a God carrier. So, as I've written in the wonderful collection of encounters that Sarojini and her co-publishers have published, for me, the Arch was synonymous with prayer and the belief in a God who answers and must answer prayer, and in particular, prayer for the marginalized and the destitute. And he did not only lead a solitary prayer life. At the South African Council of Churches in the 1970s and 80s, where I worked as a student, then as Bishop of Johannesburg and Archbishop of Cape Town, at synods and seminars, he had the gift of leading people into a deep silence, leaving no one in any doubt that they were hearing God in their stillness. So the experience of prayer, program director, in which he led you was contagious. Once it gripped you, it never let you go. Whether you saw him in action in small groups of young people or rallying the spirits of tens of thousands of people in stadia, you were intensely aware that when he spoke, it reflected the intangible yet vividly prayer life. Out of this deep prayer life also came the tears that flowed upon the death of a dear friend, such as Bishop Simon Nkwani, or the tears that came when he broke down in sorrow at hearing the stories of victims and survivors of apartheid at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the tears that join us with Jesus, who wept over Jerusalem because she did not know the things that made for peace. To this day, does not know the things that will make for peace between Israel and Palestine. And of course, this is absolutely critical, central to his ministry and witness. Desmond Tutu used to say that an effective prayer life would never allow you to remain on your knees. No, it will compel you to get up and go into the world to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, to release the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so his prayer life was a thread that ran through and bound all his varied ministries, whether it was his advocacy for peace with justice, for integrity of the environment, for sanctions against perpetrators of injustice, or for ordination of women, and full recognition of rights of all people, no matter what their sexual orientation. So perhaps, as I conclude, his most important but least recognized legacy in the world at large is that he taught us the real life-changing, world-changing power of prayer to empower us to carry the gospel to the world. So God be praised and God bless you. Thank you.
Archbishop Makgoba, I think you have brought this home so safely to us. You were talking about, not being academic about this, but that was a powerful intellectual connection. And I want to thank you so much for it. And it's so good to see you in a way that is closer from the distance that I saw you at the funeral, which you coordinated so elegantly. Thank you so very much, Archbishop.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I now want to move to our next session, which, as my colleagues have so carefully choreographed this, connects very well with the conversation that we've just been having in a very thoughtful and really, really touching way. This next session is Desmond Tutu's Ecumenical Mission and Governance. And it's going to be presented by Professor Nyameko Pityana, pioneer of the Black Consciousness Movement, Professor Emeritus of Law, University of South Africa, which you all know as UNISA, and the Desmond Tutu Intellectual Property Trust, the IP Trust. We are making connections all through with our beloved Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the particular connection of this brother to him is even more glaring. And so please permit me to read aspects of his bio so that you see that connection. Professor Pityana read law in South Africa at Fort Hare from 1967, where he came under the influence of Desmond Tutu. He qualified as a lawyer, but the unjust refusal of his admission as an attorney in 1977, together with a spate of detentions without trial and banning orders, made South Africa for him and his family precarious. In 1978, through the help of Desmond Tutu, he came to King's College London. And no doubt you can see that he's a fellow of King's College London. At King's, he graduated BD Honours in 1982. He trained for the Anglican ministry in Oxford and was ordained and worked in clergy roles in Milton Keynes and in Birmingham. He worked for 5 years as director of the World Council of Churches program to combat racism before returning to South Africa in 1992. There in South Africa, he joined the academic staff of the University of Cape Town. In 1995, he was awarded a PhD in religious studies and was also admitted as an attorney of the High Court of South Africa, and in the same year was appointed inaugural chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission. He's been principal and vice chancellor of the University of South Africa, UNISA, and he's professor emeritus in law at the same university. It's a great pleasure to welcome a fellow alumnus of King's, FKC. Professor Pityana, I hope you're there.
Fumi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation, for bringing me here. Special word of thanks to Tyrone Pretorius for the partnership with King's, as well as the president of King's College London, my alma mater. I first met, as you've heard, and I got to know Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu when he came to teach at the Federal Theological Seminary in Alice in 1967, following years of living and studying in London. At the time, I was an undergraduate law student at the nearby University College of Fort Hare. I was also very active in the Anglican Society, but also in student life at the college at large. While he was a tutor at the St. Peter's College, the Anglican Constituent College of the FEDSEM, he was also chaplain to the Anglican students at Fort Hare. From the beginning of Tutu's house became home to us. It's fair to say that during the following 2 years, we spent much time at the Tutu residence, traveled with him to ecumenical conferences, attended meetings of the University Christian Movement at Rhodes University. I could observe him entranced, puzzled even, but excited about the interactions he had with the students. It is fair to say that we were radical, impatient, angry, articulate, and imbued with a vision for South Africa that may both have caused him to fear on our behalf, but also close enough to feel part of the radical spirit that was very much inherent in us. In 1968, we went with him to attend the conference of the UCM at Stutterheim. These conferences were multiracial, but dominated in large measure by white students, and then the open but white universities. At the conference, we challenged the agenda of the conference, which had been prepared in advance, and we demanded that there should only be one item on the agenda: church and racism in South Africa. What was surprising to some of the participants was both that we refused to participate in the ritual of obedience to the past laws by taking a journey out of the magisterial district of Stutterheim and re-beginning it again when we start. We also demanded that we were to meet separately as the Black Caucus. That, as it turned out, was the beginning of the Black Consciousness movement and the pre-formation of the South African Students' Organization. Within a month of that Stutterheim conference in August 1968, and back on campus at Fort Hare, we undertook a demonstration against the university, staged a sit-in in front of the administration block. This went on for 5 days because the university refused to accede to our demands. On the 5th day, it was announced that the university was closed, and within minutes thereafter, hundreds of armed police and fierce dogs surrounded the total body of students, I think 551 at that time. The commander barked that we were all under arrest. At that point, many of us were afraid. We were scared of the dogs and the sight of fiercely armed, only white police preparing to charge at us. Enough it was to put a fear of God in our hearts, in our minds. But then our chaplains, Father Desmond, as we then knew him, and the Methodist chaplain, Simon Kubula, approached as if from nowhere. Desmond, characteristically in a cassock. He approached the police cordon and, we could tell, insisted on being arrested with us and that they would join the students. And promptly they did. And that was unheard of because many of the university staff were watching from a distance, themselves fully armed. And as for the black staff, they were nowhere to be seen. Their presence sparked a flood of emotions among us, and many knelt before Father Desmond to pray, to bless, and someone spontaneously broke into our national anthem, followed by other freedom songs. Suddenly, the police stood still, listened, watched, as if in a trance. The earlier frightened students were emboldened. The prevailing spirit was no longer one of fear, but of courage and defiance. We were all escorted out of the university in armored vehicles. But then we later understood that on the Sunday in chapel at St. Peter's College, Father Tutu broke down while he was presiding at the Eucharist. He cried the cry of tears. In preaching and explaining himself, he paid tribute to the courage of the students, who were at that point, of course, nowhere to be seen. But he was most outraged by the conduct of the police and the university authorities. The idea for him of bringing in armored police to intimidate and arrest a handful of defiant students was unbelievable. It suggested that, in fact, although they might have believed that under apartheid they were in charge and had power, but in fact, deep down, they were afraid themselves. They were afraid of the truth that the students stood for. He had come to believe that a university was a place of the cross-pollination of ideas and not of guns and dogs. And for the campus to have been under police command as if the students posed any threat was totally incredible and unbelievable to him. For years, Father Tutu recounted that moment to be perhaps for him a moment of personal conversion, politically speaking. I begin this tribute to the Arch with this personal story, both to make the point that for well over 50 years, he was a kind of companion, a father confessor, a sparring partner very often for a lifetime. I observed him closely and I admired him immensely. I'm also starting in this manner, not because I'm making a point that he was a late convert to the radical politics in South Africa after years of living in London. Nor am I saying I had a special relationship with him. I did not. I have no authority to make any such a claim. But what I do want to say is that I could almost observe those early years in Alice, the development of Father Tutu's ecumenical journey and his spiritual journey. Finally, I justify this personal memoir simply by observing that with so many tributes to the Arch from around the world, very little, if any, has been said about his radical ecumenical spirit and his radical leadership. I would like to devote the remainder of this paper to that aspect. It is important to make two statements about the Church in South Africa and the ecumenical movement at this time. First, the South African Church was at odds with the World Council of Churches, principally over the program to combat racism special fund. There was emerging as a result a cadre of Black theologians who were challenging the Church's preoccupation with a particular brand of race relations, one that paid deference to the apartheid state, as well as the actuality of dominance of the Church by white Christians, as if it was by divine right. Father Desmond himself was not elected, for example, by the Anglican Church to various bishopric vacancies, including Johannesburg. There was almost entitlement by white Christians that the Church would be dominated by white thinking, by white fears and hostility to the liberation movement, much according to the dogma of the Afrikaner nationalist regime, which they claimed to detest. And so it was considered normal for the churches to have chaplains employed by the South African Defence Force, for Christianity to be opposed to violence. By that meaning, of course, that the strategy of the liberation movement of the armed struggle. The church was opposed to apartheid, almost like a tribal warfare between the English and the Afrikaners, rather like the Anglo-Boer War being replayed all over again. And Black Christians were to inherit the moral theology of such a church. And as such, too much was made of the church struggle, as if it was solely about the Afrikaner nationalist ethos of separate but equal. For many of us, the struggle was much deeper. It challenged the church to be true to its gospel creed in word and deed. And it yearned for a church that was truly African in culture and theology. Of course, in many forums, a rigorous study of Black theology was gathering pace alongside the enculturation movement garnered by the Vatican II for the Catholic Church. In fact, it was in the context of such debates that Father Desmond published his seminal paper, Black Theology / African Theology, Soulmates or Antagonists, arguing as he did for a fusion of African theology and Black theology by an understanding of Ubuntu, what he regarded as an original African thought that would enrich theology. To this day, we talk about Ubuntu, but in fact, it was brought into currency by Desmond Tutu in 1970. I argue that that was the way in which Ubuntu made it around the world into the academic lexicon. By 1986, Father Desmond was appointed Dean of Johannesburg, a prestigious position never before occupied by a Black person. And one of the former deans was Gonville French Beitach. Dean Tutu had refused to occupy the official residence of the Dean of Johannesburg, that was, of course, in a white area. Instead, he insisted on living in Soweto. The then new Dean of Johannesburg announced his voice by writing an open letter to the then Prime Minister of South Africa. He made 3 points in that letter that would have frightened many a white Anglican. One, that freedom for the Black people of South Africa was a birthright. In his words, and I quote, "It is when once the desire for freedom and self-determination is awakened in a people for it to be quenched with anything less than freedom and determination." The second point he made in that letter was as follows: "I have a growing nightmarish fear that unless something drastic is done very soon, bloodshed and violence is going to happen in South Africa almost inevitably." Needless to say, 16th of June, barely a month later, Soweto went up in flames. Finally, the letter stated, and I quote, that you call a national convention made up of genuine leaders to try and work out an orderly evolution of South Africa into a non-racial, open and just society. This letter was widely published in Sunday papers in South Africa, and it caused quite a consternation and anger to the government, and indeed, dare I say, some embarrassment to the Anglican hierarchy. The open letter received a great deal of commentary and criticism. At the time, I was among a number of prisoners who were in detention without trial in Makhanda in Grahamstown. We took issue only with Dean Tutu's evolutionary vision of how South Africa was to change. In our view, the kind of change that was needed and called for by the apartheid regime was inconceivable. We wanted freedom now. After a short spell as Bishop of Lesotho, Tutu was appointed General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches. There could be no doubt that his assumption of the General Secretariat at SACC marked a radical turn in both theology and praxis of the South African Council of Churches. His entry was preceded by 2 seminal events. First, the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, which had caused a ceaseless furore among some church leaders. The Methodist Church in particular led the way by publishing what they regarded as a theological critique of the special fund. The gravamen of their attack was that the WCC ought not to take sides in a civil conflict of the kind that prevailed in South Africa. But secondly, and more elaborately, that the WCC as representative of and the voice of world Christianity, I quote, should never align itself with one among a group of conflicting parties. By so doing, it makes itself a servant of the world instead of a servant of God, unquote. Such sentiments had little or no support, of course, among Black Christians. The idea of support for the liberation movements was logical to many, not least because their sons and daughters had signed up for the armed struggle. It was obvious that the church, in our view, had abandoned and had gone in favor of support for the apartheid armies. Secondly, the Kairos document was published in September 1985. It sought rather to offer both a critique of the dominant theology that sustained the churches in South Africa, as well as an analysis and theological method for a Christ-like liberating and humane theology. It challenged what it referred to as state theology that had shaped the missionary church for far too long, as well as the dilemmas of violence/non-violence dichotomy in church theology. No sooner as Bishop Desmond Tutu assumed office as General Secretary did the SACC published a statement of theological principles. The centerpiece of that statement was the core belief that Desmond Tutu had enunciated again and again. I quote, God has accepted men, he said men at the time, I guess he would say differently today, through Christ unconditionally. In relying on the acceptance, the believer is enabled to love his fellow man, he said so at that time, unconditionally, and to contribute towards justice and peace in human relationships, unquote. Perhaps he would find his marriage of spirituality and Christian action or praxis very much intriguing and exciting at the time, as it was a new method of doing theology those days. And yet this enunciation of his theological praxis was not far removed from the statement of the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches is a fellowship of churches, I quote, which confess the Lord Jesus Christ as God and Savior according to the Scriptures, and therefore seeks to fulfill together their common calling to the glory of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, unquote. It is that common calling of the churches that the SACC under Desmond Tutu was to call for. During Desmond Tutu's tenure as General Secretary of the SACC.
Prof, we have maybe a couple of minutes left.
Can I finish now? Okay, thank you. During his time, the state unleashed perhaps unprecedented levels of state repression. Not only were there banishments and banning orders, there were sweeping arrests of political activists, many of them affected church ministers. It was the SACC that took on the mantle, not only to undertake acts of charity, but to give expression to both the spirituality of humanism that Tutu had spoken about, but also see to the basic needs of the people, support financially the trials in political cases, support widows, pay for school fees for children, and in many such ways alleviate human suffering. Desmond Tutu personally participated in many funerals of the victims of state-sponsored victims. Let me make a final point, if I may. Inevitably, in a desperate bid to stop this ministry, the apartheid regime established another commission, the Elof Commission, in order to expose the SACC as a communist front or the abuser of funds. Bishop Tutu's rejoinder to Elof was characteristically feisty and fearless. He asserted that the work that the SACC was doing was the work of ministry of the church, for which the church cannot be dictated to by the state. Secondly, defined the work of SACC in theological terms and challenged the apartheid state to do its damnedest against the Church of God. In a press conference following the report, he said this, and I quote, "We are constrained by the imperatives of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Until my dying day, I will continue to castigate apartheid as evil and immoral in an absolute sense. And I will burn my Bible as I have promised before and cease to be a Christian if anyone can prove to me that I was wrong in my view about apartheid." The commission did not have in his views any theological or moral competence to pass judgment on us on that score alone. His closing remark was also pertinent. "Know too," he said, "that nothing you can do will stop liberation coming to this country for all its people, black and white. You shall be free. Whatever you try to do, we are committed to justice and peace and reconciliation and are opposed to all forms of violence." And of course, Tutu was elected Bishop of Johannesburg in 1985. And in 1986, he became Archbishop of Cape Town and Metropolitan of the Church of the Province of Southern Africa. His spiritual practice was enhanced during this time. No doubt much has been written about it and more in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for taking a little longer.
No, that's okay. Prof, thank you so much. We knew that you will connect the dots in the way that you have just done powerfully. That connection to Desmond Tutu, even at King's and in the history, is so very clear. Thank you so much for giving us your time in this way. We look forward to having you back in King's at some point soon. Keep well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, may I just say that given that we're trying to make up a little bit of time,